Welcome once again to Pondering the Orb. I'm your host, the wandering fantasy author Requard, back to dig into some more books, music, and the rest. Please check out the links below in the description and hit the subscribe button. Now let's go on an adventure. This episode features two wonderful heroes from the genre of sword and sorcery, and our first is a master unlike any other. A master crafter, a master swordsman, a master drunk, and a master adventurer. Melodic Ambrose walks a world that's a little like King Arthur, a little like Amber, but what precedes is a truly great book to start off a series of novels written by the incredibly talented James Enge. Blood of Ambrose takes place in the Antillean Empire during the sudden rise of King Lathamer VI, who is consequently the nephew of our hunchbacked hero, and his equally captivating and powerful sister, Ambrosia Viviana. Together they face off against Lord Ruthven, a powerful lord who killed Lathamer's father and has designs to usurp the throne. This book is a lot of fun, and it's punchy and fast, and before you know it, you're done. I cannot recommend Enge enough, as he's one of the great lights in the modern sword and sorcery genre. Let's read a bit from Blood of Ambrose. Chapter 1. Summons. The king was screaming in the throne room when the Protector's men arrived. He knew it was wrong. He knew he was being stupid, but he was frightened. When the booted feet of the soldiers sounded in the corridor outside, he belatedly came to his senses. Dropping to the floor, he crawled under the broad-seated throne where the emperor sat in judgment, next to God's sustainer. Only there was no emperor now, and Lord Ruthven, the protector, made his judgments in his own council chamber. Did the sustainer dwell there now? Or still upon the empty throne? Was there really a sustainer? Would the protector's soldiers kill him like all the others? He pulled in his legs just as the soldiers entered the room, their footfalls like rolling thunder in the vast vaulted chamber. He hoped they couldn't see him. Would God's sustainer protect him? Was there really a sustainer? But the soldiers made straight for the throne. If the sustainer was not with him, and who could say, the accumulated precautions of his assassination-minded ancestors were all around. As he pressed instinctively against the wall behind the throne, it gave way and he found himself tumbling down a slope in the darkness. Briefly, he heard the shouting voices of soldiers turn to screams and then break off suddenly, because the passageway had closed, or for another reason. His grandmother would know. He wished she was here, but she was far away, in Sarkundun. That was why the protector had moved now, killing the family's old servants like pigs in the courtyard. He landed in a kind of closet. There were cloaked shapes and bits of armor lying around in the dust that was thick on the floor. Perhaps they were, or had been, things to help an endangered sovereign in flight or self-defense. He thought of that later. But just then, he only wanted to get out. By flailing around the dark, he found the handle of a door and plunged out into the bright dimness of a little-used hallway. Hadn't he been here before? Hadn't grandmother told him to come here, or someplace like here, if something happened? He hadn't been listening. Why listen? What could happen in the palace of Ambrose, with the Lord Protector guarding the walls? And they had cut his tutor's throat, cut Master Jarrett's throat, and hung him upside down the drain, just like a pig. He had seen it once at a fair, and grandmother said he must never, never do that again. The sudden memory renewed his terror. He found himself running down the corridor in the dim light, the open doors on either side of him yawning like disinterested courtiers. There was a statue of an armed man standing over a broad curving stairway at the end of the hall. The king was almost sure grandmother had mentioned a place like this, but without the statue. If he went down the stairs, perhaps that would be the place, and he would remember what grandmother had told him to do next, if she had told him. But as he passed down the statue, it moved, and he saw it was not a statue. No statue in this ancient palace would be emblazoned with the red line of the Lord Protector. The Protector's man reached for him. The king fell down and began to scuttle away on all fours, back down the corridor. The Protector's man dropped his sword and followed, crouching down as he came and reaching out with both hands. "Now, your majesty," the soldier's ingratiating voice came, resonating slightly through the bars of his helmet. "Come along with me. No one means to harm you. Just a purge of ugly traitors who crept into your royal service. You can't go against the Protector, can you? You found that out. And stop that damned screaming." The king was screaming again. weary, hysterical screaming that made his body clench and unclench like a fist. Looking back, he saw that the soldier had caught his cloak. There was nothing he could do about the screaming, just as there was nothing he could do about the soldier. Then Grandmother was there, standing behind the Protector's man, fixing her long, terribly strong hands about his mailed throat. The soldier had time for one brief scream of his own before she lifted him from the floor and shook him like a rag doll. After an endless series of moments, she negligently threw him down the hall and over the balustrade of the stairway. He made no sound as he fell, and the crash of his armor on the stairs below was like an applause that followed one of the Protector's speeches, necessary, curt, and convincing. Before the echoes of the armed man's fall passed away, Grandmother said, "Lathmer, come here." Trembling, the king climbed to his feet and went to her. Grandmother frightened him, but in a different way than most things frightened him. She expected so much of him. He was frightened failing her, as he routinely did. "Lathmer," she said, resting one deadly hand on his shoulder, "you've done well, but now you must do more, much more. Are you ready?" Yes. It was a lie. He always lied to her. He was afraid not to. "I must remain here to keep them from following you. You must go alone down the stairway. At the bottom there is a tunnel. Take it either way to the end. It will lead to an opening somewhere in the city. Go out and find my brother. Find him and bring him here. Can you do that?" How? The king was tongue-tied by all the impossibilities she expected him to overleap. He was barely 12 years old, and looked younger than he was, in some way still thought younger than he looked. He was aware, all too aware of these deficiencies. "You know my name? My brother's name?" "His name?" the king cried in horror. "Then you do know it. Say it aloud. Say it to many people. Say, he must come to help Ambrosia. His sister is in danger. By then I will be, you know." The king simply stared at her, aghast. "He has a way of knowing when people say his name," the king's grandmother, the Lady Ambrosia, continued calming. "That much of the legend is true, but more is false. Do not be afraid. Say the name aloud. You are in no danger from him. He is your kinsman. He will protect you from your enemies, as I have done." From the far end of the corridor echoed the sound of axes on wood. "I had hoped to go with you," his grandmother continued evenly, "but that will be impossible now. You will have to find someone else to help you. I wish you luck. But remember, if you do not find my brother, I will surely die. Your Lord Protector, Earthven, will see to it. You do not wish that, do you?" "No," the king said. And that, too, was a lie. It would be a relief to know he had failed his grandmother for the last time. "Go, then. Save yourself. And me as well. Find..." Knowing she was about to say the accursed name, her damned brother's name, he covered his ears and ran past her, skittering down the broad stone steps beyond. He passed the corpse of the fallen soldier. He kept on running. While our first book highlighted the recent generations of sword and sorcery fiction, we travel further back to its founding, and an author who deserves far more recognition. C.L. Moore is one of the many unheralded voices in science fiction and fantasy left out of the conversation, and the immense contribution women have made to the canon of genre fiction. But more importantly, Moore provided a deeper seed. She arguably created the swordswoman of sword and sorcery. Red Sonja, Valeria, Xena, Michonne. Arguably without JIRIEL of JOIRY, none of them would have had foundation. Moore paved the way through 6 amazing tales of elegant sword and sorcery fiction focused on a sensual, emotive writing style that was unique for its time and modern today. Featuring the ever-present theme of the will, first and foremost, defeating the power of brawn and tyranny as a gallant woman lifts up brave steel, is a great shame we only ever got 6 of these tales. C.L. Moore was and remains a master of fantasy fiction. These are stories that not only serve as the foundation for sword and sorcery, but for much of what is done in fantasy today. This collection, linked in the description below, is complete, and if you are wise, you will go and pick this up immediately. Let's read from JIRIEL of JOIRY by C.L. Moore. The Black God's Kiss by C.L. Moore. Chapter 2. JIRIEL opened her yellow eyes upon darkness. She lay quiet for a while, collecting her scattered thoughts. By degrees it came back to her, and she muffled upon her arm a sound that was half curse and a half sob. JIRIEL had fallen. For a time she lay rigid in the dark, forcing herself to the realization. The sound of feet shifting on stone nearby brought her out of that particular misery. She sat up cautiously, feeling about her to determine in what part of JIRIEL its liege lady was imprisoned. She knew that the sound she had heard must be a sentry, and by the dank smell of the darkness that she was underground. In one of the little dungeon cells, of course. With careful quietness she got to her feet, muttering a curse as her head reeled for an instant and then began to throb. In the utter dark she felt around the cell. Presently she came to a little wooden stool in a corner and was satisfied. She gripped one leg of it with firm fingers and made her soundless way around the wall until she located the door. The sentry remembered, afterward, that he had heard the wildest shriek for help which had ever rung in his ears, and he remembered unbolting the door. Afterward, until they found him lying inside the locked cell with a cracked skull, he remembered nothing. JIRIEL crept up the dark stairs of the north turret, murder in her heart. Many little hatreds she had known in her life, but no such blaze as this. Before her eyes in the night she could see Guillerme's scornful, scarred face laughing, the little jutting beard split with the whiteness upon his mirth. Upon her mouth she remembered the remembered weight of his, about her the strength of his arms. And such a blast of hot fury came over her that she reeled a little and clutched the wall for support. She went on in a haze of red anger, something like madness burning in her brain as a resolve slowly took shape out of the chaos of her hate. When that thought came to her, she paused again, mid-step upon the stairs, and was conscious of a little coldness blowing over her. Then it was gone, and she shivered a little, and shook her shoulders and grinned wolfishly, and went on. By the stars she could see through the arrow slits in the wall, it must be near to midnight. She went softly on the stairs, and she encountered no one. Her little tower room at the top was empty. Even the straw pallet where the serving wench slept had not been used that night. JIRIEL got herself out of her armor alone, somehow, after much striving and twisting. Her doeskin shirt was stiff with sweat and stained with blood. She tossed it disdainfully into a corner. The fury in her eyes had cooled now to a contained and secret flame. She smiled to herself as she slipped on a fresh shirt of doeskin over her tousle-red head and donned a brief tunic of link mail. On her legs she buckled the greaves of some forgotten legionary, relic of the not long past days when Rome still ruled the world. She thrust a dagger through her belt, and took her own long two-handed sword bare-bladed in her grip. Then she went down the stairs again. She knew there must have been revelry and feasting in the great hall that night, and by the silence hanging so heavily now she was sure that most of her enemies still lay in drunken slumber, and she experienced a swift regret for the gallons of her good French wine so wasted. And the thought flashed through her head that a determined woman with a sword might work some little damage upon the drunken sleepers before she was overpowered. But she put that idea by, for Guillerme would have posted sentries to spare, and she must not give up her secret freedom so fruitlessly. Down the dark stairs she went, and crossed one corner of the vast central hall whose darkness she was sure hid wine-deadened sleepers, and so into the lesser dimness of the rough little chapel that JIRIEL boasted. She had been sure she would find Father Gervais there, and she was not mistaken. He rose from his knees before the altar, dark in his robe, the starlight through the narrow window shining upon his tonsure. "My daughter," he whispered. "My daughter, how have you escaped? Shall I find you a mount? If you can pass the sentries, you should be in your cousin's castle by daybreak." She shushed him with a lifted hand. "No," she said. "It is not outside I go this night. I have a more perilous journey even than that to make. Shrieve me, father." He stared at her. "What is it?" She dropped to her knees before him and gripped the rough cloth of his habit with urgent fingers. "Shrieve me, I say. I go down into hell tonight to pray the devil for a weapon, and it may be I shall not return." Gervais bent and gripped her shoulders with hands that shook. "Look at me," he demanded. "Do you know what you're saying? You go down," she said firmly. "Only you and I know that passage, father, and not even we can be sure of what lies beyond. But to gain a weapon against that man, I would venture into perils even worse than that." "If I thought you meant it," he whispered, I would waken Guilherme now and give you into his arms. It would be a kinder fate, my daughter. It's that I would walk through hell to escape, she whispered back fiercely. Can't you see? Oh, God knows I'm not innocent in the ways of light-loving, but to be any man's fancy, for a night or two, before he snaps my neck or sells me into slavery. And above all, if that man will Guilherme, can't you understand? That would be shame enough, nodded Gervais. But think, JIRIEL, for that shame there is atonement and absolution, and for that death the gates of heaven open wide. But this other... JIRIEL, never through all eternity may you come out, body or soul, if you venture down. She shrugged. To wreak my vengeance upon Guilherme, I would go if I knew I should burn in hell forever. But JIRIEL, I do not think you understand. This is a worse fate than the deepest depths of hellfire. This is beyond the bounds of all the hells we know. And I think Satan's hottest flames were a breath of paradise compared to what may befall there. I know. Do you think I'd venture down if I could not be sure? Where else would I find such a weapon as I need, save outside God's dominion? JIRIEL, you shall not. Gervais, I go. Will you shriv me? The hot yellow eyes blazed into his, lambent in the starlight. After a moment, he dropped his head. You are my lady. I will give you God's blessing, but it will not avail you. There. We have covered the recent, we have covered the past, but now we take a look to the gleaming edge of a bright future. Swords and Sorcery has long steeped itself to its legacy dating back to the 1930s, but our lineage has continued with new voices. Every time someone takes up the call for Swords and Sorcery, our traditions endure, greater than ever. A new publication has arisen to give its voices a new edge, forged of an adamantine will to see action-packed fantasy achieve greater standing and recognition. New EDGE Swords and Sorcery Magazine seeks to resharpen the swords against the darkness, bringing new ideas and perspectives that not only pay homage to the past, but break forward to a beautiful future. And their 0 issue is absolutely free on their website, featuring some wonderful pieces of short fiction, interviews, and insights to the genre. You can download it in its multiple formats as number 1 begins to take shape and manifest. Check out the link in the descriptions for New EDGE Swords and Sorcery Magazine. A decisive koala once again turned me on to this wonderful music producer from Australia. DAVZ has been putting out wonderful Chillsynth that features a plethora of different styles and sounds, incorporating fascinating rhythms with an ethereal, meditative ambience you can sink into. It's not often you listen to someone really work their synthesizer, so this next track is a treat for the season. This is long in release by DAVZ from his 2021 wonder of an album, Aura of Thought. This episode of Pondering the Orb is very, very special, because for the first time we're featuring a track from an album that hasn't come out yet. And we're not just featuring any band, but arguably the best band in melodic death metal today. Arising from Joensuu, Finland, this dynamic collective of 5 musicians debuted in the Halls of Awaiting in 2002, and for 20 years have given hope to those of us always one with our sorrows, marching through the shadows to fight our black heart rebellions, to pay valediction to our deepest fears. This is my favorite band. Without their albums, I wouldn't have had the courage to do this show. And I need to thank Hetta at Ginger Vine so much for helping make this happen. From their upcoming 9th studio album, Anno 1696, this is Lillian by INSOMNIUM. For our more segment, we're going to take a break this month and be back the next with our first returning guest, Daryl the Seedman Cell, for a special Christmas episode of Pondering the Orb. But in the meantime, I have a new podcast. Please enjoy the introductory episode of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation fan podcast hosted by myself and my father, Jake Requard. We made this for my son, Ben, but we know there are so many great Star Trek fans out there that we're putting them out for free on YouTube. Please enjoy, and as always, peace and long life.
You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to the show. This is Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. My name is Jay Requard. With me is my father, Jake Requard. And how are you doing today, Jake?
I'm good, Jay. Thank you.
So this show is an exploration of Star Trek The Next Generation. It's a show that's dear to both your and mine's hearts. Debuting it in September of 1987, this show was actually the first show that I was allowed to stay up for, and we would actually watch together. The show is formatted to where Dad and I are going to watch each and every episode of the entire run of Star Trek The Next Generation. And after each episode, we're going to convene here for a podcast and just discuss the episode, some of its themes, and just reflect on the show in terms of what it means to us, what the show meant in itself, and kind of what our general reflections are now looking at it almost, God, how many years has it been? Decades now from when it first debuted. So, Dad, before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit of your professional scientific background? Because I think some people at home would be interested to know about that. And then tell us a little bit of your history as a Star Trek fan or a Trekkie.
Yeah, okay. I think I realized that I really had an interest in science because in high school, I was in honors English for all the last 3 years, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. And in 11th and 12th grade, we had to do a term paper on a novel of some sort. And in 12th grade, I chose Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles. Everyone else was doing their papers on traditional literature, Milton or F. Scott Fitzgerald or Shakespeare or something like that. So, I've always remembered that because I felt like I was unique, that I was interested in science fiction at that time. And then when I went to college, I majored in biology. And if you major in biology, you have to take a fair amount of chemistry. And where I went, you had to take a basic physics course also, so that I was well steeped in sciences with an emphasis on biology during my college time. As far as introduction to Star Trek, I can remember back, I think it was in 1966 when the original series came on. And that was a time where in Baltimore, where I grew up, there were only 4 television stations then. And as I recall, Star Trek came on NBC. I don't remember what night and so forth, but I can't remember. I don't know if I saw the first shows, because I remember stumbling on it or hearing about it from the newspapers or something like that. And I was fascinated by it because, this was in the middle of the space race between the United States and the Russians in 1966. we were 3 years away from the first landing on the moon. Um, and there was a lot of interest in space travel, getting people into orbit successfully, and then making the jump to a lunar orbit and then landing on the moon. And then I believe that the original series only lasted what, 3 or 4
3
seasons,
seasons.
3 seasons, and then it was canceled. And there was an outcry to bring it back, and I don't to NBC, and I recall that they decided not to. And then there was still enough interest in Star Trek that it went into cartoons and things like that. And I was never into the Star Trek cartoons. Um, However, once into, I guess it was, you might help me with this, Jay, when the cast of the original series started making full length feature films, I was all into that.
Yeah,
So when
1979.
Right, 19, well, and that was
Motion
significant
picture.
because, right, the motion picture. So, that was a good, almost 10 plus year leap from the original series being on television to the first film. And at the same time, you still had interest in science fiction and so forth, particularly, you know, space and visiting, learning about other species on other planets and so forth, because Star Wars came out in 1977, the first Star Wars
Right.
episode. And that was really significant. I think one of the most significant scenes and most enjoyable scenes in the first Star Wars was the bar scene
Mm-hmm.
when they walked in and they tried to find Han Solo and the Millennium Falcon so they could have transportation, and just all those different aliens. And it was just an amazing thing. And it kind of makes me think it fit in with what, Star Trek started to represent in terms of, you know, following up on the idea that's still prevalent with people is, are we the only ones here?
Mm-hmm.
Are there others out there? And then in that, just, the cast of the original series through their full length feature films, I think that obviously led into whatever year it was in, well, yeah, with in 1987, that Star Trek was rebooted as the next generation.
So, interesting backstory to that. Originally, the motion picture was supposed to be the reboot of a show. Um,
Hmm.
they were originally going to do a pilot for a new show, and I don't know if you remember the guy. He's supposed to play the captain. Um, in the motion picture, but Kirk comes in and takes command from him. The blonde fellow.
Yes, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
he was
Mhm.
later on Seventh Heaven. I can't remember the actor's name, but he's actually in jail right now for molestation charges. Believe it or not, crazy thing. But
Oh my,
he
yes.
was supposed to be the captain of the new show,
Uh-huh.
and the woman who ended up playing V'ger, she was cast to play essentially, I think, the science officer.
Huh.
But they came in at the last minute and they decided there was really no interest for a show, but because of Star Wars, as you mentioned, there
Uh-huh.
had been a interest for a movie. So they
Right.
basically rewrote the pilot episode into a new movie starring V'ger.
Uh-huh.
So 1987 comes around and there's an interest for a show finally at CBS.
Right.
But the problem is they can't afford the original cast. And the original cast is older too, but they've already been in all these successful films and they're expensive to just cast for a weekly episodic TV show. So they come
Mm-hmm.
up with an entirely new cast that features, Patrick Stewart as Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Jonathan Frakes as Commander William T. Riker, Marina Sirtis as Commander Troy, as a Lieutenant Commander Troy. Though we'll get
Mm-hmm.
into that because they play with some interesting things with the rank in this first episode.
Mm-hmm.
But you have this new cast. So in 1987, this new show comes on, and since we're there now, the first episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation is Encounter at Farpoint, which is actually a 2-part episode. Getting started, what do you think of this episode in general?
I, you know, I thought about it, and we watched it the day after Christmas, and I watched it a couple days ago again, and I think that since it was, the reboot of a Star Trek television series with that was occurring many years in the future after James T. Kirk and the NCC 1701. I think they started out with the NCC 1701D
Yes.
Enterprise. That it was a transitional show to kind of introduce the new crew.
Yeah.
Um, you know, some of the things they set out forth that would be covered in future episodes of Next Generation and future seasons even was the relationship between Picard and Beverly Crusher.
Mm-hmm.
That Jack Crusher, who was Beverly's husband, had
Yes.
died, and there was always a little bit of that. Picard seemed to was interested, had some romantic feelings back during Academy days for Beverly Crusher,
Mm-hmm.
and also it brought in Wesley. Wesley helped win that in the Farpoint episode because he had this desire to see the bridge, and
Yeah.
Picard did not want children on the bridge. He was uncomfortable around children, but when Beverly and Wesley showed up on the bridge and were in the turbo lift, and Picard saw how Wesley resembled his father, he welcomed him into the bridge. But then when Wesley knew too much and there was a problem, they got him out of there
Yeah.
quickly. Also, there was
Well, I have a question about that for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
What do you think about the introduction of children to the show? Because fans are really split on, well, we're initially split on Wesley Crusher. He's looked at in a favorable view now. But originally, a lot of people did not like Will Wheaton, and they did not like the Wesley Crusher character on the show.
I'm sort of prejudiced on that because I haven't watched all of the different iterations of the Star Trek genre, but one that I've really
I think
watched
you're just
completely.
missing Discovery, right?
I have not. I watched some of Discovery. I've watched some of Deep Space Nine. The only other one that I've really watched thoroughly, and I did it during the summer, and I started again. I'm on the 4th season of Enterprise, so that's what it gives me a little prejudice because I think that, of course, Enterprise, that series didn't come until 2001. I think that started, but in that storyline, which was even before the original series, they brought up the issue that if you were going to have larger Federation vessels and they were going to go on long missions into the galaxy, that from a social and psychological standpoint, it might be important to have families on board starships. So, obviously, Roddenberry and the writers and so forth, when they were writing the Next Generation, they were already thinking about that. We need to change, make this different in that these ships are much larger. They're going on missions, for a longer period of time. It's going to be important for the crew to have family members, which at the same time I find sort of unusual because one of the things that is uh, evident in all the Star Trek series iterations is the intent is for the ships to have an exploratory mission.
Yes.
However, whenever they go out and find somebody new, there's always friction. There's always, they get into the same sort of geopolitical and power struggle issues that we find ourselves in still on Earth to day.
There's an immense
And
scale of danger to take children
yeah,
into.
yeah. So it's really on a practical basis in this universe, this next generation universe, it's a real commitment for the crew members to bring their family along because they're putting them into danger,
Yeah.
um, and so
So
on.
so when we're meeting characters like Wesley Crusher and Beverly Crusher, we have backstory built in with Picard, and Picard in himself is an interesting character that we'll touch on here for a moment.
Hmm.
Um, you grew up with Kirk. For
Hmm.
you, he's your captain. I
Right,
grew up with Jean-Luc Picard. For me, he's my captain.
right.
What was your initial reaction in September of 87, if you can remember, when you first saw Jean-Luc Picard versus what you had grown up with Captain Kirk?
Yes, I do remember that, and watching the Farpoint episode made me think of that. Is that Kirk was, brash, but at the same time affable. In the Farpoint episode, um, Picard comes back as uh, very intellectual, standoffish,
Mm-hmm.
almost a martinet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the way he treats Riker when Riker comes on board is like, like this Picard guy is a real ass.
Yeah.
And then he kind of, once he interviews Riker and asks him about, how what Riker's opinion is in terms of his duty of protecting the captain of a starship. Riker passes that test, and then Picard lightens up. And at the end of the episode,
Yeah.
Picard lightens up, so he shows more of his human affable side, but he remains very different from Kirk.
What do you think is besides the brashness, I think the big difference between Kirk and Picard for me is, and it's funny that you bring up Enterprise because you're watching Archer right now.
Right.
And fans always used to be like, well, Kirk is a pirate. Kirk is a pirate. I was like, well, if Kirk's a pirate, then Archer's Genghis Khan at this point. Um,
Yes.
you know, Archer's committing war crimes. He kind of has to, but
Yes.
yeah, he is. Um, I think the biggest difference between Kirk and Picard is that Kirk carries this, I guess, this kind of aloofishness to, he doesn't show any fear whatsoever, where Picard is just so focused in terms of his emotions that you don't ever really see anything outside of Picard, but when you do see emotion, you see these great flashes of it.
Yes.
Where it seems like with Kirk, like Kirk is always focused, Kirk is always steady. Kirk can get fiery, but you know, Kirk is Kirk. It takes a, you have to get something out of Picard. Are you there?
And of course, I don't know, I can't remember if this even came out in the original series, but how he was the only one to beat the Kobayashi Maru test is a testament to Kirk's, you know, sort of his strength that he's
Mm-hmm.
going to, while he's affable, he's going to do whatever the hell he pleases to accomplish his mission.
Yes.
Um, Kirk, the in another comparison is in the original series, there's mention of the prime directive and so forth, and it's a little bit, it's explained and
Yes,
understood,
this is a big one we should touch on.
but Kirk is a little bit loose with it, as where Picard has this strong, much stronger moral, ethical mindset, and it comes up in the next generation constantly. The what is the proper utilization for lack of a better term, of the Prime Directive.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because I think for Picard, the Prime Directive is almost religion to him.
Yes.
Like
yes.
he out of all the things he can do, I think Picard always has two missions. Don't violate the Prime Directive and establish the safety of his crew.
Right.
Where Kirk, multiple times in the original series and in the movie, basically says, my first responsibility is to my crew. To the point where, I'll go out of my way to save them, even if it means destroying someone else. Picard doesn't have that. Picard still has the Prime Directive to the point where he will sacrifice some people if it means adhering to the Prime Directive, which we'll see later on in other episodes, like episode 3, Code of Honor, where this comes up again.
Yeah, I agree with that. Picard really struggles as where Kirk, it was there for Kirk, but he didn't struggle with it like Picard does.
Yes, very true. So let's talk about the main.
Couple other comments just in the introduction of characters. I thought it was interesting that it's like, why do they have to put the separation of the saucer section in here?
So let's talk about this because to me it's one of the worst parts about the episode.
It doesn't fit in at all, other than it gives Riker a challenge. So again, Picard gives Riker that challenge through the manual docking. So it's like it gives, it presents Riker's character as this guy knows his stuff. So Picard really needs to, Picard still needs to get to know Riker, but this guy's a pretty strong character.
But is it giving a MiG pilot the middle finger while inverted?
Yes.
No,
yeah.
It's such a boring scene where it sits, and there's supposed to be so much tension to it, and I think the tension, there's this weird moment where they play the theme song.
I know,
and it's going so slowly, and it's like, why are you playing the theme song through this? It's interesting that we talk about the saucer separation, because to my knowledge, they only do it twice. They may do it 3 times, but they do it this episode, and then they do it against the Borg in Best of Both Worlds Part 2 when they rescue Picard. But other than that, we never see this saucer separate from the ship ever again.
Yes.
So before we get back to the plot, let's touch on the ship real quick.
Just 2 other things real quick. I think it was interesting when Riker first saw Troy that there was immediately a connection there. So everybody goes, there's backstory, there's history between them. So that kind of sets that little, pursuit, we have to watch in future episodes what their relationship is. And I thought the other thing that wasn't bad was DeForest Kelly's appearance as McCoy, just to make a bridge between the original series crew and the next generation crew.
It's a better scene to strangely throw in there than the separation of the saucer. Yes. And it's a very, very touching scene with Brett Spiner as Data.
Yes.
I think their little interplay where Bones looks at him and say, "I don't see no points on your ears, boy."
Yeah, exactly.
And it's just this kind of really wonderful moment where I think we all touch back to Spock and we all touch back to Kirk.
Yes.
And we just, there's those passing of the torch moments that you don't get often in these kind of shows, especially one as long as Star Trek.
That's exactly what it was, a passing of the torch. Yes.
And it's an effective one.
Yes.
What do you think of Bones being alive at 137? What do you think that says about medical technology in the future? On top of him being alive, what does it say about medical technology in the future?
I think it just, kind of, let's say this was in 1987. it was, describing what the possibilities were in terms of um, modern medical science, improving to extend life. And, if all things, if we did, if kind of make an editorial comment, if we had a good healthcare system that could treat everyone, and that there was less economic inequality, so that people had equal access to quality foods and nutrition, um, I think that it would be possible for, I mean, I've seen some scientific papers that indicate that if people had the right nutrition, exercise, diet, weren't exposed to infectious diseases, that, the lifespan could, get people, children that are born now could easily live to 100.
Do you think that an expanded life in the future is a good thing for the progress of humanity? Do you think us living to 137 is is a is a point that we should celebrate, or do you think it's something that we have to weigh heavily?
I think we have to weigh heavily on it, because our society would have to change radically in terms of, we still have from uh, the social security system the expectation that people would retire in their 60s. That's not possible for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people now. Older people are finding that they're actually physically and mentally healthy if they stay engaged in uh, uh, a job of some sort, even if it's unpaid, if it's volunteer work. And I think it comes down to an income level. If you're an older person and you live to 100, you know, where's the economic support going to come from to pay for your housing and your medical care and so on? So there's not an easy answer to that, because I think there's a lot of um, societal changes we need to look at to really make it possible, to make it work.
Can I mention something, since you brought that up, and how we would have to make societal changes?
Mhm.
Uh, how old do you think Picard is when he becomes captain of the Enterprise?
Um, I kind of thought about that because of how I think he lists his age. His late age is described in the new series, CBS Access series, of being 92 or 95, something like that.
Yeah,
So I think that when he becomes the captain of the Enterprise in the next generation, he's probably then in his 40s.
59.
59, really? Wow.
Yeah, and he's 75 in Nemesis, Star Trek
Wow.
Nemesis.
Wow.
So this brings up something that you just mentioned, that Picard at 59 is still considered viable and able to be the captain of a Federation flagship going into deep space with 1,000 people on board, including children, where in today's society, I'm not necessarily sure that we would give that sort of responsibility to someone his age, as you're mentioning it. Like, it's keeping people engaged and keeping people um, integrated into society, that they still add and they still show how much potential they have, and they can keep building on that potential.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because my guess is if the largest, comparable type of vessel would be, American aircraft carriers, and the captains of those ships are probably, if they're 60, they're old, because once you get to 60, if you're still career Navy, you probably going to be an admiral or something like that, and you're not going to be uh, commanding a vessel.
Right. So the first big plot point is the introduction of Q. The Enterprise is
Yes,
on their way to investigate Farpoint Station.
right.
They're looking to make a trade deal with what was the name of it?
Zorn.
Zorn.
Zorn's. Yeah.
Yeah, Gopler Zorn of the Bandy. Groppler
Right.
Zorn.
Right.
Um, so they run into the omniscient entity known as Q. Now, Q is, for those at home that know, is played by John Delancey, and the Q is part of the Q continuum, which is never strictly defined as either a set of omniscient individuals. I'm hesitating calling them gods for a reason here because I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Or is it a single individual that takes the form of many different Qs? And is the Q that we're seeing in John Delancey just a version that is presenting himself to Requard? So Picard and the crew run into Q, and Q tells them to turn back, that they are unable to go forward because they are unworthy to explore deeper space. Essentially, humanity is not ready to face the perils and mysteries ahead. Um, this leads to Q making a charge against humanity, deeming them a savage race or
Mm-hmm.
a savage child race, often invoking many of uh, our historical narratives from the past, including I think he originally shows up as a French naval captain, and then he transforms into a World War II officer.
He was a Marine captain.
He was
Yes.
a
Right.
Marine captain, and then he turns into a soldier from the post-atomic wars,
Yes.
which are very interesting to me because these apparently are soldiers who use drugs to fuel their performance in combat,
Mm-hmm.
which gets into an interesting topic because Roddenberry had a lot of interest in the LSD program that the government was running with the
Mm-hmm.
CIA. God, what was it called? MK something. MK Ultra.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the future, the post atomic soldiers are very MK Ultra
Mm-hmm.
in a way. But you know, we get to the crux of what may be the entire show of Picard versus Q dealing with the idea of what is humanity? Is humanity savage? Or is humanity able to progress and evolve to the point where it's able to explore new worlds, new dimensions, new perceptions, and basically find a foothold in the galaxy, which Q believes humanity is not worthy of. Um, Looking at this, let's start with I think a rather interesting question I already touched on. Is Q God? What do
Yeah.
you
I
think?
I don't think his God, because as you said, he describes himself as part of the Q continuum, and there's no definition of what that really means, but it implies that there are other beings like him. And he, at one point, says, you know, look at all the history you have of making wars over limited resources and tribal god images.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the fact that he mentions the god images, it just left me the impression that he's not presenting himself as God, but he is presenting himself as a higher level of consciousness, a higher level being, you know, that has capabilities above and beyond what humans have at that time. Or he has capabilities beyond what humans have yet to discover in themselves, possibly.
Does that put into a question to be quote unquote God or a God? Do you need omnipotence? Because Q, by all argument, is omnipotent and omniscient. He knows everything that's going on. He can change and alter reality. By us distinguishing the fact that he is not a god, does that automatically take the idea of omniscience or omnipotence, and maybe that's something you don't have to consider when we're talking about the idea of an actual big G universal, maybe outside of us, God. Because what if Q reached the point of being omniscient and he's not God, what does that say about God?
The three adjectives for God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent.
Yeah.
And I don't think Q fits all of those categories because
Not
one
omnipresent, you're correct.
omnipresent. One of the things I noted at the end, toward the end of the show, when the Enterprise crew has figured out, what the Bandy have done to this life force that they've captured. Um, and Picard is, talking to Zorn, and they're providing energy to the captured being down on the planet's surface, and it's going to join its mate, whatever the relationship is between those two unusual beings. It was interesting to watch Q standing behind Picard, and of course Q is in the same Starfleet captain's uniform that Picard has on,
Mm-hmm.
and Q is very carefully watching Picard and listening to him because Picard ends up being the judge of the bandy,
Mm-hmm.
and he delivers justice with empathy to
Mm-hmm.
them. And if you watch Q's eyes, it's like um, he's figuring out this puzzle. And Q at one point says, "I made it too easy this time."
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that said that Q was making a bet that he was going to trip these humans up.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out that he underestimated them. So
Okay.
because he did that, that's he's not omniscient. He
So
didn't know what was going to happen.
true. Um, so the charge that he levels, humans are a savage race unworthy of galactic expansion. This question is tested in the first episode, and it's actually the question that comes back in the very last episode, the series finale in season 7.
Uh-huh.
Um, it will be the main theme. So we will actually come back to this question. So we're people at home are probably like, why are they chewing into this? We're chewing into it because this is something that we're going to be reviewing every so often. So I'm going to ask you, Dad. Um, are humans a savage race unworthy of galactic expansion? What do you think?
Um, we're a we are a work in progress still.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things when they're in the court scene, um, with all the post nuclear war rabble,
Mm-hmm.
um, Data tries to pitch in. He says no Earth citizen or race or forebears can be prosecuted for past events, and he mentions it's a united Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's they're describing that Earth has become united. They've they're not fighting wars on Earth anymore. Um, we learn in subsequent episodes of the Next Generation that they've ended poverty. There's still the vestiges of some, you know, racial bigotry and so forth. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, I made a note when the other thing they did just for fun in this episode was introduce the holodeck.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I think it was Data said some Data said something to Riker when Riker's talking about how unusual it is to have an android as a companion, as a crew member. And Data says prejudice is very human.
Yeah.
So that still exists. So, in this whole point, um, in part of the whole zeitgeist of the Next Generation and Star Trek, all of the different series particularly Next Generation, is it points out, I mean, part of the thing that Q does, he's holding up a mirror to mankind through the card
Mm-hmm.
and say, look at yourself. Where are you? Where, you've come from, you have these roots of savagery and so forth. You know, you've ended that sort of practices on your planet and so forth, but are you really past that? And part of the test is, how are you going to figure out this situation on Farpoint Station? Are you just going to say, hey, this is a good deal that we've captured this entity that can, you know transmutate materials into anything you want? Yeah, we're going to keep it. We're going to have them build all kinds of starships for us and so forth. And that's again where um, Picard figures the puzzle out and surprises Q, because he, you know, lets the being go, the captured being go,
Mm-hmm.
and delivers justice with empathy. So it's again showing that, mankind in this story can progress. It needs to progress more. So that, I mean, even if you look at where we are right now, today, even just
Mm-hmm.
with politics in the United States and in the world, we have, you know, really, really bad challenges, really, really difficult challenges in politics and the pandemic and so forth. And it's a big challenge for mankind to get through this at this point.
Mm-hmm. I I think one thing that the show has difficulties dealing with sometimes is what is the actual point of the Federation? And there's a necessary question of what's the point of Starfleet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they are on this 5-year mission to explore deep space. What is the point of exploration besides discovering and knowledge, which Picard states multiple times that's what they're out there for? But Q keeps pointing back, like, to all these explorers and saying, well, all these explorers were out here for conquest. What's the thing that stops you from conquest? And the argument is the prime directive.
Right.
We don't go to pre-warp civilizations and bring them in or alter their destinies or alter their communities to take advantage of them. However, once they have achieved warp, we try to bring them in. The
Mm-hmm.
question is the Federation Rome? And if so, are their intentions of exploration purely good or just?
Um,
Because this gets into a hard question I think that we're dealing with here, because you talk about the progression of mankind, which I agree is something that has to occur from where we are now to get to where we are to where they are in Star Trek. But at the same time, I think the argument that can be made by Q in this is that you're all still out here trying to take something over. You're just masking it with the idea of exploration and gaining knowledge. How many other explorers said that beforehand too?
it's a real conundrum in relative to how can the human species advance,
Mm-hmm.
because if you just look at where I think we are on the planet right now, the best example probably being just dealing with climate change.
Mm-hmm.
um, it's something that has to be addressed together. The whole planet has to address that, and perhaps we'll come together soon enough so that it doesn't cause a great catastrophe. Um, we'll just have to see. But I think that that sort of philosophically and that social political organization, there is almost a proselytizing that since that's been done on Earth, and once humans get out into the galaxy and they encounter other civilizations, there seemed to be in the story that the other civilizations have a sense that cooperation is better than conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And again, then you extend this coming together that has happened on Earth, and you extend that throughout various sectors of the galaxy. However, the Federation comes across other civilizations that aren't there yet. The Klingons, the Romulans.
Well, both of those have their own empires.
Yes, exactly. And with time, if you follow the whole story through, ultimately, there is an alliance between the Federation and even the Cardassians.
Mm-hmm.
But it again, there's cultural differences there, so that you don't have the same sort of relationship among those federated worlds that are thinking more like, well, we're going to try to work together for the common good. And you're always going to find that people being people, even perhaps of different humanoid species, there's always going to be diplomacy and figuring out what different thought patterns are, and mores and ethics, and that sort of thing. But at the same time, one concern I always have, it goes back to a prior comment about having families on the ships. Um, these starships have potent weaponry on board,
Mm-hmm.
so they can be exploratory vessels, but when necessary, they can be warships also.
Well, it's also made very clear early on in this episode that this is the best ship that Starfleet has. This is its newest, its best, its toughest, its most powerful ship. The weapons on this ship are the top of the line for Starfleet.
Mm-hmm.
So like you said, it is, you know, as much as you could say Columbus's ships were ships of exploration, he certainly turned them into warships when he got to the West Indies. I think there's an interesting dichotomy going on there that we kind of miss, that one person's exploratory vessel is another person's warship, and I think you nailed that one very well. Um, Let me put it this way, and I think that this is an interesting thought experiment when it comes to the Federation. Let's say you're a Klingon, or let's say you're a Romulan, and you both come from these civilizations that are empires. They believe in emperors, they believe in one person above all, and all of a sudden you see the Federation, and it's claiming that it's not an empire, and that it's just there for exploration and trade and universal harmony. If you're a Klingon or a Romulan and you're part of an empire, how do you not look at the Federation and not go, bullshit, you're an empire too?
Those empires um, probably think just that. At the same time, they're practical enough of what's the benefit of being in active conflict with this Federation entity, or as the circumstances change, is it to our benefit to cooperate with them, to have some sort of defined alliance with them? Um, it take a Ferengi attitude that what's in it for me? What profit is to be made here? What benefit do I get if I talk to these people, if I deal with these people in some way?
It's interesting you bring that up. There's a famous clip from DS9 where Quark is arguing with a Vulcan, and she's a Romulan, and they're arguing about she wants to continue the war. I think she wants to upgrade weapons, but he makes an argument that's basically based in the Ferengi rules of commerce, that
Yes.
that, through economics and trade, we can avoid war and have something so much better just by trading and sitting down and dealing with each other in terms of what can I give you, what can you give me, versus this idea of, oh, I own this, I have to protect this. Quark's entire argument and the Ferengi's entire argument is, why are we fighting? We can just pay each other.
Right, exactly.
I think the question of how the Federation looks in 1987 versus how it looks now is very stark for me growing up in the world that I've grown up in. I think before 9/11, the idea of looking at the Federation as imperialism is probably not something I would have reached for. But in some ways, I think the Federation has. I think the Federation represents some things about America and some things about the United Nations and some of the things about NATO. Starfleet is very much NATO in a way.
Yes.
I think Next Generation kind of takes the attitude of all those organizations and says, if this is geared towards actual peace and exploration and sharing knowledge and sharing culture, this can work. I think the problem is it only works if everyone's on board. There's this very, you brought up Data telling Riker that prejudice is very human. And that's a great scene. There's another great scene in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, where they're at dinner with Chancellor Gorkin, his daughter, Chang, and the other members of Chang's delegation. No, not Chang's delegation, Gorkin's delegation. Remember when they broke out the Romulan ale when they weren't supposed to?
Yes.
And there was something, I think someone said something about, on the Federation side of the table, about, joining the shared humanity of the Federation. And Gorkin's daughter says, the shared humanity, even you don't even realize how racist you sound.
I remember that. Yes. I remember that. Yes. Right.
And I think Worf is a very interesting, Worf and Data specifically are very interesting additions to the crew of Next Generation, because the entire crew of the original show was all human except for Spock. Well, even Spock's half human. Right. This is the first show where you have an android and a Klingon, two non-humans on the show. What do you think? What do you think Data represents for you in terms of the overall aspects of the show, and what do you think of the character meeting him here in this very first episode? Because one thing that I noticed going through the show is that starting here, the character of Data is going to go through some very dramatic changes over the first season. And by the time we get to the second season, Brett Spiner is going to figure out how to act with the character. But the first season of Data is very, Data smiles a lot, and Data tries to tell jokes, and he laughs. And, he has this weird grin sometimes. And it kind of goes away after they meet Lore. But there's a kind of weirdness to it.
Yeah, I think, again, this first episode, Encounter at Farpoint, is introducing characters. So, it introduces Data. And again, it goes back to the McCoy scene where it emphasizes that Data, is an android. He's something we haven't seen before. So, I don't think there's enough information here for us to figure out, well, what is this character going to be like? I mean, the one interesting thing is when they're on the holodeck and Wesley falls into the water because of the loose rock, and Data jumps in and lifts Wesley off up out of the water with one hand and has this almost ghoulish smile on his face.
Yeah.
It's like he doesn't, yeah, you kind of said it. He doesn't know what emotion to express. He's trying to say sort of like, I saved you, I'm helped you, but he's his self pride is a little bit overboard by the look of it
Yeah.
has on his face.
Well, there's even that scene where Dr. Crusher's examining him, and he mentions that, no, that's the next episode. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead. Um, you know, the interesting thing about Data is that we're being introduced to a character that is basically the embodiment of an issue we're dealing with now in the modern day, artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we're going to get to the episode Measure of a Man later on in the show, where we deal with the idea of, is Data a sentient being? Which the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in 1987, when you're hearing the words android, that this character is completely artificial, what's your reaction to this? Because Spock being Data is essentially the Spock character.
Yes.
Um,
Um,
Spock's half human, so like it's not out of the realm of grasping Spock being half human, but like grasping Data being an android and essentially not being a real or biological organism.
I, I I think it was something totally new. Probably most people were intrigued, but really didn't understand what he represented. As you say, if you look back, he was representing artificial intelligence. And I don't think, other than in at DARPA or places like that, the term AI was being used anywhere. Um, it was just a couple years before that people were thinking of androids more like, you know, robots like R2D2 and C3PO, so that Data was representing, at least in popular culture, something totally new.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that from what you've read about AI, what you've seen and heard about it, do you think an AI like Data would be a good thing? And this we'll get into this conversation later on when they introduce the character of Lore, because then we're going to get into the very difficult question of like, you built a bad robot, then you built a good robot. How did you do that? But in general, do you think producing an artificial being like Data, given where we are now and what you know now, is necessarily a good thing?
Um, it can be depend on how it's used.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, in medicine, there's a lot of artificial intelligence that's being used to examine various medical images, and they're able to, in some cases, see and diagnose disease conditions that physicians may not be able to see. Um, there's talk of having um, artificial intelligence, or robots is the right term, that could be caregivers. There's, I think the biggest concern is, do you create some sort of artificial intelligence? Um, do you weaponize it? And it gets into the whole Terminator series, the whole concept of, if you if you weaponize AI, particularly with information technology, that's you know the heart of it, is it going to be able to get out of human control? It's a IT mechanistic Frankenstein.
Well, I think you hit on something really important there. If you let it get out of human control, by all definitions, Data's out of human control. Data's sentient. Data can make his own decisions. Data is choosing to serve in Starfleet. Data is choosing to not kill Wesley Crusher when he lifts him out of the water. Data is Data could foreseeably walk through the halls of the Enterprise and take everyone out. He can compute trillions of trilohertz, or the huge amounts of data instantly.
Well, and
Isn't
in some future episodes, when the biological units are threatened and they have to shut down, he's given responsibility for running the ship because he's not subject to the radiation or the toxin or whatever
right?
that the humans are suffering from. And the other thing that's, this kind of jumps ahead, but it just, it makes you it makes you wonder in terms of, you look at the progression of scientific thinking and science fiction thinking within the whole Star Trek genre.
Mm-hmm.
Look where AI ended up in Picard of last year,
Right.
where Picard actually becomes a synth.
Yeah. Well, that gets into the very difficult question of, okay, Data's definitely sentient, and we know
Yes,
that we can transfer. And Picard, by the time that show comes around, and since he is a quote unquote golem, um,
yes.
is Data, and Picard actually discusses Data having a soul and all of that. But if you build a machine like Data and you give it sentience and you give it, he later on gets an emotion chip.
Hmm.
If you give him all that, did Dr. Soong just create a soul out of nothing, essentially?
Boy, I mean, that just brings up a huge metaphysical question in terms of, if a created sentient artificial intelligence based being can be given a soul, then where did biological humans get a soul from?
Well,
And is and is this and what is the soul? Is soul merely, and not, I shouldn't say merely, but is a soul
yeah.
really consciousness?
Well, I so there's a professor named I forget his first name, Penrose, but he studies consciousness. And there's a lot of discussion now about our reality being a simulation.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that he has discovered, however, is that consciousness is not a computation. While you could look at everything else in the noble material universe with a mathematical equation, consciousness cannot be defined mathematically.
Mm.
So getting into the question of, like, is our soul our consciousness? It brings in the question, you said, is Data given a soul? One thing, I think, one question that we may want to ask, maybe not is Data given a soul, does Data assume a soul?
That might be the better question.
Do we assume souls? Like,
Well,
I think it gets,
yes, because if you look at evolutionary biology, does a single celled organism have a soul?
yeah.
Does a
Mm.
cat have a soul?
Mm-hmm.
Does a lower level primate have a soul?
Mm.
Is it the point where you go from a chimpanzee to a human, or you go from a a homo, you know 1 million years ago, in Africa? Was that humanoid ancestor, was it aware of its own sentience? That Did it have a soul, or is that a point where, in terms of biological evolution and the evolution of consciousness, that a soul shows up, which
Mhm.
kind of gets back into the metaphysical question: is what the hell is a soul anyway?
I think we'll be coming back to this question a lot when it comes to data. Um, so moving on, as we noticed, they get to Farpoint Station and they discover that the Bandine Zorn have basically kidnapped this creature, this
Mm-hmm.
jellyfish-like creature that can transform its own matter and also create matter out of essentially nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And using the same energy from their transporter array to
Mm-hmm.
feed the creature and heal it, they are able to help the creature lift itself from the planet and rejoin its mate.
Mm-hmm.
You're a biologist. What do you think about exobiology in space? Giant jellyfish holding hands through the cosmos, and where do you where do you rate in terms of being a Star Trek fan this moment?
I'm trying to think back at the original series whether there were any entities of this sort. I can't remember specifically. I think there were. Um, it's a real stretch in a way that if you had an organism that large, and many of these that the one thing at the end of the show when it showed the two mated jellyfish like creatures moving off, it's like, well, how do they of course, I guess the question of how they propel themselves through space, they could turn themselves into a ship and that could probably be capable of warp speeds and so
Mm-hmm.
on. So that's I don't have a good answer for that at this point. um it gets into questions of, is all organic life have to be carbon based, or
Mm-hmm.
because of its closeness on the periodic table, is it possible to have silicon based life forms,
Like
which,
we see in the crystalline entity.
like the crystal Enley or in the Horta in the original series?
Oh, true. Yeah, the Horta. Um,
So, and then it gets into, this is kind of a real stretch, but it gets into you know what some you know um, uh, scientists thinks, and some of these are pseudosciences also, that think that what UFOs represent are um, transdimensional beings that are coming from a different space and time.
I
So,
th-
if there's any, I mean, that's really, in a sense, that's why I say it's pseudoscience. I mean, some of that might have a basis in quantum physics, but it's very much, to me, science fiction. But again, one of the things about science fiction is that it can point to what could be developed in the future, what could be understood in the future.
I agree. I think I think these creatures touch on some very interesting concepts and questions that we have about the universe. First, is life strictly planet bound? Do you have to have an M class planet to produce life? Or can you have creatures that live outside of a breathable, workable, organic atmosphere like these two creatures, which are large and immense creatures floating through space? Um, I think one of the things that to kind of answer your question, I kind of imagine that these creatures can generate their own warp bubbles or their own
Mhm.
energy fields, so that's how they're kind of moving through things. Um, I think xenobiology, especially in science fiction, is very fascinating because it deals with the idea that space itself is a natural environment too. It's not just this kind of void full of irradiation and dark energy. It's an actual jungle to itself.
Well, there's two interesting scientific points. As I read recently, that you think if you go up into the upper atmosphere, into the stratosphere, that it's sterile. There are bacteria
Keep
that
going.
exist and they can be cultured out of the air way up in the atmosphere. The other thing that is just, is not biologic, but I read an article recently when both Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 went outside of the heliosphere into the beginning of deep space, of interstellar space. They found that the electron density in interstellar stellar space is higher than what it was within within the heliosphere.
Mm.
And scientists have been surprised by that, and they don't totally understand it. And that gets into, we I don't think we still understand what dark matter is,
I
which,
was
like, we think that you get into the space between the stars and so forth, that there's nothing there. Well, you know there we don't know what really is there. Another thing, interestingly, I've read recently that if when people, astronauts, cosmonauts, go into the International Space Station and they get exposed to somehow space outside their controlled human environment, that space has a particular smell to it,
mm-hmm.
like burnt toast or something like that. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, what are they smelling? You know?
So it's interesting that you bring up that we don't know a lot about dark matter. I was watching this thing recently with Ben about dark energy and dark matter and what they think it is. It turns out dark matter actually might be dark, maybe might be a form of gravity. So it might be better to term it dark gravity.
Hmm.
But the interesting thing, it brings into the question of, okay, there's space and there's space time, and somehow these things are all interconnected together.
Mm-hmm.
And one theory out of many, is that this dark gravity, or this dark matter, this dark energy, is what is basically adhering space and space time together,
Mm-hmm.
and that you have dark energy and or this dark gravity in varying densities throughout the universe. So the adherence between space and time thicken and thin as you go through the universe, which makes which actually makes something like interstellar travel via a warp drive uh, a very interesting phenomenon to pull off, which we'll get to later in a different episode. But
Right.
I think one thing as it pertains to these creatures, you know, we really don't know so much still about the universe. It's just like we still don't know a lot about the bottom of our oceans.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's still so much possibility out there that when I see episodes like this where we are dealing with these interstellar creatures that aren't only familiar in some sort of Earth-like shape, like the jellyfish, they also have the ability to like communicate with humans or humanoid creatures like the bandy, because they never really say are the bandies human. I always assume that the bandy kind of are human, but they're able to communicate with the bandy. Troy's able to communicate with them emotionally through her empathic powers as
Mm-hmm.
as a betazoid,
Right.
and they're clearly capable of this higher kind of consciousness of feeling pain, of feeling gratitude, feeling remorse, feeling joy, of being back together, when the two mates are finally reunited. I think there are so many interesting questions asked in this episode about the potential of life in the interstellar universe
Mm-hmm.
outside of planets
Mm-hmm.
that you know I I watched this episode 3 times to prepare for this recording, and I kept just kind of coming away with it that not only is there a possibility of this wonderful, beautiful, diverse myriad of life out there? But Picard, somewhat in answering Q, as you said, judging with empathy and bringing justice with empathy, also realizes that he's somewhat a steward of the galaxy, and the crew themselves realize that they are kind of stewards of the galaxy, and that it is, wrong for the bandit to be holding this creature captive and using him for exploitation, especially for trade. And it's very much a animal rights episode, if you look at it, where the crew's basically saying, like, you it's not only that you can't abuse a sentient life, we're not going to let you abuse this animal life that is traveling out here in the galaxy. We have a responsibility to that too. And I
Yeah,
find that to be fascinating.
yeah. One comment that Picard made to Q toward the end, and my note is that it was Picard turns the tables on Q when he says to him, "Why do you use other life forms for your rec- recreation?"
Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting, but it also goes back to whether Q is God, because again, Picard turns the tables on Q at that point. Um,
Right.
and just about what you're saying, the last note that I made, and we don't have to stop talking, but again, where Picard kind of loosens up to Riker at the very end, and Riker says something to the effect says, "Well, Captain, do you think all of our missions will be this challenging?" And Picard says, "No, I think they'll be much more interesting. Let's see what's out there."
Yeah.
Which, when he says "let's see what's out there," that is, that's the end of the episode, which is very much a continuation of Kirk, because I think that was the last thing Kirk said in at the end of the Undiscovered Country.
Yeah. Well, I think, and we can end this here.
Sure.
Though I do think that there are some things that we can. There is one thing I do want to talk to you about that has to do with Star Trek. Now that we're here,
Sure.
but leading off of the show, um, what do, a big debate that's happening right now within Star Trek fandom is, what do you think? What people think Gene Roddenberry's vision was when the show first got started versus what the show is now with Discovery and Picard and Lower Decks. Um, I've always thought that Gene's vision was that we would look up into the night sky and that we would look up to the stars and we wouldn't be afraid. We would be hopeful that we would see our future, our destiny, and an opportunity to be part of something greater. That the universe full of all that star stuff was in us, and that we were just going home the moment we leave this planet and we go out looking. Um, what do you think Gene Roddenberry's vision is, and how do you think this episode or the Next Generation capture it?
I think from the reading I've done about him, and the limited amount of information I know about his thinking or philosophy, is that he wanted to present a positive future for mankind. Um, he developed the whole genre, uh, in the 60s, which were a very turbulent time.
Mm-hmm.
The Cold War was in full swing. Um, it's like everyone thought that World War One would be the war to end all wars, and all that did was set up World War Two. So that was like World War One was Act One, and World War Two was Act Two, and that went right into capitalism versus communism. And I think he wanted to present a picture of we can evolve to something better.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it was, since we were, you know, starting to look at travel into space, just, you know, orbit the Earth and then go to the moon, he was, as a science fiction writer, he was, painting a picture of how things could be.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what you're saying is, when you talk about the discussion within Star Trek fandom, is as we've gotten into some of these later stories, genres, Picard, you know, Discovery, and so forth, it's shown that the universe, as we go out into it, is to some degree going to be a continuation of what we've had to do here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Okay. So, but before we go, yay or nay on Encounter at Farpoint? Do you like the episode? Do you dislike the episode?
I like the episode because I think it is a good, first episode of a new iteration of the Star Trek genre. I think it's a good introduction of this new crew, this new ship.
Mm-hmm.
Gives enough depth into their character so that you can get interested in them. And if you, then, watch the series back in 87 through 93, whatever the number of years were, then you could really understand how the characters develop. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I've seen that when I've, as I said, I've been watching the Enterprise series, and I've seen a lot of changes in Jonathan Archer. Um, a lot of it's very interesting, the whole relationship between Tucker and DePaul
Mm-hmm.
and so on. Um, the relationship between the relationship between Earth humans and Vulcan very much changes um, during and
Yeah.
Enterprise. So it's setting this episode is setting up all the more good fun things just from an entertainment perspective that can be seen as you pursue the story.
Yeah. Um, okay, so kind of getting off Star Trek for a moment. It seems this year in the news there is a lot of talk about UFOs. And you and I don't really talk about in our private conversations we talk a lot about politics and economics and spirituality and all that, but we never really talk about UFOs. Um, what do you think is going on with all of these sightings happening in the news? And I have a feeling that this year or the next, the U.S. government or some government around the world, as it's already happened in Israel, I think that we are going to have a confirmation of uh, uh, non-human life.
Well, funny you should ask, because one of the things I was going to talk to you offline, but it can be part of this, is that I
Oh, it should
stumbled
be.
on Amazon Prime a movie called Encounters, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this guy who's a physician, Steve Geller, I think that's his name. And he talks about how he's created this organization called CE5. And he's very much into meditation and has a lot of, Indian meditation philosophy and so forth. So that what a lot of the UFOs are extraterrestrials, but they're transdimensional. They're from a
Mm.
different time, different part of the universe, not even maybe this galaxy. But if you set up your mindset, if you meditate and make yourself open to them, you can actually communicate with these people. And he's got these videos of people going to, like, in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, in Sedona, in places in Florida, where people are gathered together and are meditating, and they see these lights just spontaneously appear in the sky, or during the day they'll see clusters of UFOs and all of this sort of thing. And I just it's a long movie discourse discussion, almost 2 hours long. I didn't finish it, and I thought I'm going to Google CE5. So I did that, and there was a Wikipedia article that kind of discounted it. Said this is nothing but UFO porn.
Yeah.
And I thought, Yeah, I can see how that is. And one of the things he posits is that there's a conspiracy by governments that they really know, and they have known, that there are extraterrestrials that have visited us. And he makes the claim that, like, there's this underground facility in Arizona where they've got 5 different extraterrestrial spaceships they've captured, and they've got,
Okay, so you
aliens
have heard of this guy.
in,
Okay.
in prison there and all of this sort of thing.
Oh, that's
And
different.
and he's saying that, the reason that the governments don't want to tell us the truth is because um, it would threaten their control. They're the powers that be. It would threaten their control. Now, in
So,
fact, one thing he said was kind of crazy. It had something to do with the King of Luxembourg or something that was in this, and that, probably a good Roman Catholic, where he said, well, we want to manipulate things so that when the public, humankind, knows that there really are extraterrestrials, we want to kind of tie it into the second coming of Christ. And I'm thinking, now, if this UFO porn is the coming of Christ, that seems to me just as nuts. But so, but you bring up a good point, is why did the Defense Department and the US government release these videos of the Navy jets chasing the UFOs?
I think
That's probably happened many, 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 many times before, but it's never been made public.
so. Two things. Um, since we're recording this, we should probably review for the audience at home listening to this, and for Ben later on years down the road, when he's like, what the hell are Pop and Daddy talking about? Um, so one of the things that happened, I think it was end of November, was that a former Israeli defense minister came out and did an interview where he basically said that world governments are in cahoots with these alien civilizations, and they have been for years, and that essentially this goes back to World War II. And I have heard one of the bigger alien conspiracies I've heard is that we've been in cahoots with aliens since World War II, and in fact, we were in cahoots with the good aliens because Hitler was in cahoots with the bad aliens. But then you have to believe that Hitler dies in 1955. Um, I think we're I think putting all the conspiracy things to the side, and I think the conspiracy thing is exciting for people to get into because it's a lot easier to digest and it's less boring than the truth. Um, and I don't think the truth is boring. I just don't think the truth is going to be as exciting as people think it is. I don't think that I don't think next week or at the end of the year a UFO is going to come down and an alien is going to come out and we're going to hand them flowers. Like, I don't think that's what the government's going to say.
Oh, like the scene from
Men in Black.
Men in Black. Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Like, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think we're suddenly going to be talking to Bebop 5 at the end of the year.
Well, see, and the other thing that's interesting that this CE5 gentleman says is that the um, the way that aliens have been portrayed is generally that they will be hostile, that there'll be a threat, that they'll
Yeah.
be similar. And Hawking even said this, is that we really maybe shouldn't be putting, messages out inviting people in, because they, when they come, they may not be like the Vulcans. They'll be like Columbus coming to the New World. Whenever you have a more advanced civilization coming upon a less advanced, generally the less advanced loses. That's sort of the principle. But what this guy is saying is that he talks a lot about consciousness
Mm-hmm.
as, related to energy, and he mentions quantum physics an awful lot also.
Well,
So
that's the thing for a lot of the people who are into conspiracies have also gotten into quantum physics too,
right,
because
and
a lot of people try to use quantum physics to validate some of their
and
unscientific viewpoints.
right, yeah. Well, yeah, I can see they just say, oh, it's just quantum physics. One of the things he presents in this film, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, is that Ronald Reagan, as president, when he spoke to one of the sessions of the General Assembly at the UN, he said, what would happen if we had an alien visitation that we had to deal with? And he didn't say whether it was good or bad, but he said, wouldn't that bring us all together? Because we would see how we all are one together. And, the point was like, why did he say that? And, Reagan, from what I hear, having lived in California while he was president, he and Nancy were very much into, um, having their fortunes read and, all of
Oh
this.
yeah.
They were very much into that sort of thing.
Oh, the Reagans were into that occult scene. Like,
Yes.
well, like people forget Alan Parsons was like heavily into occultism, and Alan Parsons was basically the American who helped founded our, establish our rocket technology. Um, Seriously, people, a lot of people don't know this, and there's a show about Alan Parsons, but Alan Parsons was this rocket engineer who practiced European black magic in his spare time in California with like 10 to 15 people in these huge cult rituals. I'm dead serious too. And he had government clearance and everything. It's kind of crazy if you think about it. But, I have a friend named AJ Hartley who's a New York Times bestseller, and he helped write a series of sci-fi novels with Tom DeLonge, who's the lead singer of Blink 182, who believes in UFOs like diehard. And one of the people they um, got to talk to, I need to look this person up real quick. So if anyone,
Go ahead. Yeah.
um, chief of staff, no, not. I'm trying to remember. There he is. Well, that's his picture. John Podesta?
John Podesta was advisor to Obama.
No, so John Podesta was chief of staff to the Hillary Clinton campaign too.
That's right. Yeah. That's
So
right.
I bring up John Podesta because John Podesta during the Clinton administration pushed
remember this.
really hard for the declassification of UFOs.
Yes, I remember this.
Like
Yeah.
he believes this.
Right.
I think that the government by the maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but in our lifetimes, I don't think we're going to meet aliens, but I think they're just going to confirm that they're real. Like at this point, there's so much video evidence out there of things in the air. Maybe if they're not aliens, maybe they're transdimensional beings. But I just kind of have this feeling that we're kind of edging up on something here as a society, and that, the media is starting to talk about it a lot. And it's starting to show up on CNN a lot. It's starting to show up in newspapers and on the internet a lot. I think that we're really kind of on the edge of confirming extraterrestrial life.
Yeah, and that brings up, just gets into the whole, getting back to Star Trek, or what it represents is, if that is confirmed, it's been thought that, if, aliens came down and they landed and they weren't hostile, but they just, that most people on the planet are very earth centric still.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of like, instead of thinking that the sun revolves around the earth, most people know that isn't the case anymore. But a lot of people think from a particularly religious standpoint that we're it. God created us and we're it.
Yes.
And if somebody, the mind game that I've already played is, if somebody came down from Andromeda, from a planet, and they landed here and they were friendly and we talked, and they said, well, and we asked them, what's your religious beliefs? He said, well, we really don't have any. He says, and they said, well, don't you believe in Jesus? And they would say, who's he?
Mm-hmm.
And that would blow people's minds, because so many Christians so firmly believe in Jesus as being universal.
Yeah.
But what may happen is you describe Jesus' philosophy or Buddha's philosophy
Mm-hmm.
or the um, the um, the Bhagavad Gita,
Yeah, and
and
they get
the
it.
aliens would say, "We understand that. We believe in the same thing,"
Yes.
and that goes back to Teilhard de Chardin, Jesuit philosophy of Christogenesis.
Yes.
That if aliens came down and they confirmed what Jesus represents, that's going to blow people. People are not going to be able to understand that because they're going to have to shift their whole thinking of religion and so on. But once we could get past that, it could make a big difference of how we relate to one another.
Well, weirdly, this does get back to this for to encounter at Farpoint because it gets back to the question of Q. Q's an alien. Um, what if these aliens have this kind of a power that looks like omnipotence to us? And what if they were friendly, and what if they wanted to share that? And it really did transform how we view ourselves in terms of our own individuality, how we see each other and our greater human community, but also, you brought up the point of us being very earth centric. um I've been thinking about that a lot recently just because everything that's going on in the country right now, especially with Trump trying to contest the election, and the real difficulty of watching so many people kind of just line up to the idea that that's okay. um I think that there is this kind of human centrism to us as a species that I don't think it makes us savage. I don't think Q's right when he says that we're a savage race, but maybe our inability to progress is that we still haven't found the ability to see the universe, to see ourselves in the universe. Because I made a point earlier on that I think Gene wanted us to look up and see that the same star stuff that was out there, the molecules of the universe are in us. We should be able to look out into the stars and see ourselves there.
Well, yeah, you bring up a kid. That's a good point because it's the same thing that the Apollo astronauts perceived when they made the trip to the moon, and they could look back on the Earth, and they had a completely different perspective of our place in the universe. And if you can go to, and this has happened, I think that one of the deep space probes took a picture from, the outer planets back toward the Earth and showed it could demonstrate Earth as this small dot.
Mm-hmm.
And if you really think about that,
Oh, we're a speck. We're a speck in the universe.
exactly, we're so small. And I think that, yeah, I think you're right about that. That if you can look at, if you can lose that prejudice about being so earthbound, that can make a big difference. The other thing, bringing about this, if there's going to be some public revelation that aliens do exist, that other civilizations, other entities other than humans do exist, who's controlling that really?
Yeah, who controls that narrative?
Or because is if there's this greater consciousness, are we
Mm.
in control or are the aliens actually in control?
So there's this podcast I listened to by this MIT scientist named Lex Friedman, who his entire specialty is AI. But he was talking to a physicist. I forget the guy's name, but they were talking about God, and it's interesting we're talking about Q. And you brought up omnipresence. If let's say all of our reality is a simulation, which means these aliens would be part of a simulation as well. Um, if there is something of a God, it lies outside of our perceivable, knowable material universe. And technically, and I'm probably going to get some shit for this online. Um, I often struggle with the idea that maybe we should include in our material universe the ineffable things that we perceive internally. Because, we, so we could look at it as that we only have these mortal shells to let us know that we're perceiving. Like, these are our sensors.
Mhm.
And maybe that these are the only things that let us know that our consciousness is real and that it exists. If you look at it from the perspective that the Earth is so small within the universe that we're a speck of dust on the cosmic winds,
Mm.
it can make you feel really small and make you feel really little. But I think the thing is that Picard is able to look at those creatures, and the crew's able to look at those creatures and see themselves in those creatures. And that's the act of compassion that divides us from human savagery. The ability to see, and in some ways, it's Gorkon's daughter. It's kind of a smack back in the face to Gorkon's daughter. She says, you say our united humanity, how racist. And it's like, well, yeah, our united humanity. At least we treat, at least we're willing to treat things that don't look like us better than you Klingons are. You'll stab it with your batleth. We'll at least send it home. I think that if we do have confirmation of uh, extraterrestrial life, especially intelligent, sentient extraterrestrial life, I think a lot of people will be scared because it
Mhm.
really will, like, especially people in our family. I think they'll be scared, but at the same time, I think that if they haven't blown us up yet, and if they haven't enslaved us yet, like, they can't be that bad. And if
That's
they
that's
if
the
they aren't
thesis of the
starving us, and
yeah, that's the thesis of the CE5 group.
but at
That
the same time, you brought up Reagan being into all that stuff. Reagan still believed in trickle down economics. Do these aliens believe in trickle down economics?
I
Like,
don't think so.
what what do they think about the NASA budget? Like, I
Yeah,
have questions.
right.
But on that, we're gonna end this episode here.
Hey, one thing I just once you saw that we're just dust in the cosmic wind. If you wanted to have some music to play before the podcast and the end, you could go to Kansas, Dust in the Wind.
I
Know that
love that
song?
album. Um, but Dad, thank you for
Thank
coming
you. It
and
was
being
fun.
yeah, we'll do this again soon with
It's good spending this time with you. Yes.
yeah, the next episode is The Naked Now, which is Star Trek Next Generation season 1 episode 2. We'll be back to review that next time. Thanks everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Good night. Bye bye.
Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Pondering the Orb. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and please check out all the books and the music in the links below. I'll see you again soon. Safe journeys.